Okay, we are live here on the episode 13 of the Nightmare Press podcast. I have my guest today is a guy I've known for several years, back when we weren't doing much of anything in the community. Preston Fassel. He is an author, journalist, biographer. He's done all kinds of stuff. He's an actor too, and he's done some. Well, yeah, I guess.
I've
So
died on screen, if you consider that action.
yeah, okay, well, okay. He's appeared in a movie, and he's done some film production. So it's good to have you here, Preston. I've been following you off and on through the years, and I'm glad to see you really getting somewhere. I remember when I first we both were part of a another publishing company that went under that I won't name. I didn't actually get published. I was about to when they went under, but reading Our Lady of the Inferno was one of the reasons I chose that. I submitted to them because I thought, well, this company cares about quality, and this because this is a really good book. So
Well, thank you.
hey, you're welcome. And so let's just go ahead and start with the obvious. What started your writing journey?
My writing journey, that goes back to first grade, and our assistant principal was retiring, and they asked everybody in my first grade class to write these short stories to explain why our vice principal was retiring. And to this day, I don't know where I came up with this, but at the school at the time, they had this thing called the Gold Slip program. And if you were seen doing some kind of like active civic duty or virtue, we're going back to the 80s here. Uh, I feel so much of my early life I can explain with, well, it's the 80s, or well, I was born in the 80s, but you got these gold slips and you could turn them in for like little tchotchkes, prizes, toys, like stuff from Party City or what's that catalog they used to have back in the day where you could order all them party favors from, and you could trade these gold slips in for them. And in my short story, the students were behaving so well and they were handing out so many gold slips that the program was no longer sustainable. And so our vice principal vandalized the school and blamed it on the students as pretext for eliminating the gold slip program. But she didn't account for a security camera that got her on video. And so the reason she's retiring is she has to go on the run from the law now for vandalizing the school. And I turned the story into my first grade teacher, Mrs. Maher, and she reads it and she leaves the class in charge of the classroom assistant and leaves. And then Mrs. Maher comes back like 10 minutes later and she's like, Preston, you have to come to the office with me. And she hustles me down to the principal's office, and there is Mrs. Domain, the vice principal who's retiring, Mrs. Pellicer, our main principal at the time, and I think maybe a couple of other members of the office staff. And I'm just thinking, like, you are so screwed. Like you just said, the vice principal of the school would like vandalize it and blame it on kids. Like you're going down for this. You're in so much trouble. And they put the story in my hands and they say, read it. And they had me sit there and read it out loud. And everybody in that room cracked up. And they were just so happy and so delighted. And that was the first time that I realized that my writing, my words, my imagination could have that impact on people and could move people and like cause them to respond in a way like this. And that was the moment I knew you're going to be a writer.
So from that point, that definitely sounds like an interesting story. Have you ever decided to put that out in like in a collection of sorts?
Oh, man, I don't even know what happened to it. My mom has some of my old stuff. We lived in a subdivision in St. Louis that was under development back in the early mid 90s, and as they were clearing space, all of the homes that had been completed would get overrun with vermin from the fields. And this one year we had a terrible mouse infestation in our basement, and they made nests out of all these old school papers. I was actually very delighted a couple of years ago to go home for the holidays and find out that my mom had discovered some stuff had survived the mouse infestation. uh, Piggybacking onto this, that first grade short story actually led to me writing the third grade Christmas play, which is just personally delightful to me that they picked the one Jewish kid in the class to write the Christmas play. But I did, and we staged it. I wrote our third grade Christmas play, and it made it about this was back in the big Shaq era, and so it's about this basketball player who's very obviously just supposed to be Shaq, and
Yeah.
he gets hired to replace Santa Claus or step in for Santa Claus because Santa Claus is sick this year, and the North Pole thinks that this would be a good PR move to essentially have Shaq replacing Santa Claus, and it's this Christmas play about the fallouts of replacing Santa Claus with a celebrity basketball player. And he gets arrested. And this is before the Tim Claus Santa Claus, by the way. I had elves breaking a replacement Santa out of jail before the finale movie. But yeah, that still exists. But the short story that got me all started, I sadly believe, is Mouse Food.
Yeah. Hey, you know what? That would have made a great Christmas story. Goodness knows they need some new ones that are good. I mean, so obviously the reaction that the faculty gave your short story, you said that really made it click that you wanted to be a writer. So I'm assuming that probably led to you reading a lot more. And who are
Oh,
some of the people you really got into reading?
so I really feel that this is I got started because my mom would read to me so much. That was a really big thing with her, was that from as far back as I can remember, she was probably reading to me before I was even pre-verbal, before I could understand anything that she was reading to me. But some of my earliest memories with my mom are her taking me to the library, reading me books in the car at Sonic in the summer. The library in St. Louis is right down the street from a Sonic, and we would go get books and then go to the Sonic, and I would get what are they, the plushies. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I
No, I
forgot
don't
what.
think. Yeah, I don't think Sonic is legally allowed to call them slushies, but what Sonic doesn't call a slushie. And we would sit in the car. My mom would read to me, and then as I got older, I would sit and read myself. My mom's the one who introduced me to Edgar Allan Poe. My mom was reading me Telltale Heart and the Raven back when I was however old I was when the Simpsons episode aired where they did the Raven, because I was like, that's so cool. And my mom was
Yeah.
like, well, do you want to hear the rest? And do you want to hear like the other things this guy wrote? And so Telltale Heart. My mom's the reason I'm a horror fan. She's the one who showed me Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Night of the Living Dead, Exorcist. Actually, her and my dad both showed me The Exorcist, which doesn't make any sense because my dad doesn't do horror at all. I don't know why my dad was there watching The Exorcist with us, but he was. But yeah, Edgar Allan Poe is the big one that I really remember. And I remember my mom had this paperback, and I think it's like this anthropomorphic, like it's a painting of a walking raven going down like a country lane in the front of it. Then I remember later on I had the Sam's Club abridged complete Edgar Allan Poe, and I still remember it had like the blue spine. It was a hardback and the famous painting or photo of Edgar Allan Poe on the cover. She is the one who got me into the Great Illustrated Classics because I had seen a Sherlock Holmes movie, and so she bought me the Great Illustrated Classics Hound of the Baskervilles. We used to shop at Sam's, and they used to have an excellent book selection at Sam's, which sounds really strange today, but you could find stuff in the Sam's book section. You could find other places. That's where a ton of my books came from as a kid. My mom would buy books at Sam's, but I got started on the Hounds of the Baskervilles, Great Illustrated Classics. Do you know what I'm talking about here with these the Great Illustrated
Yeah.
Classics? Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. For anybody who's watching this who doesn't know, back in the 1980s and 90s, there was a company that put out this line of books called the Great Illustrated Classics, and they would rewrite classic novels at like a fifth grade reading level. And it was meant to be this introduction for younger readers to prime them for reading adult versions of these books when they got older. It was also meant to be a sort of gateway drug into literature. It worked for me. But I have these really clear memories of my mom reading me Journey to the Center of the Earth, and we watched the Disney version, Gertrude the Duck, H.G. Wells' Time Machine, and this is really weird. And this is something that has not haunted me, but it's been a thing that's lived in the back of my head for years. The Great Illustrated Classics edition of the Time Machine is unique in the Great Illustrated Classic series in that the person who adapted it added new material.
Oh, I didn't know
And
that.
It's really wild because it's almost a completely original short story unto itself, where the time traveler goes to like this post-apocalyptic future where humanity is like restarted, but it's now under this like almost Bioshock style totalitarian regime, and he like develops this rivalry with this guy who he cracks over the head with something to like steal the time machine back. And as a kid, you read that and you think, oh, this is really cool. This is part of the book. And then I
Yeah.
grew up and actually read H.G. Wells' Time Machine. I was like, where the hell did all that come from? And I'll periodically try and figure out what the idea and origins and impetus for that was. But yeah, the great illustrated classics. It was all this big self-feeding cycle. My mom would read to me. I believe that's what got me wanting to write, got me reading more, and it was this sort of positive feedback loop.
Yeah, because well, that's definitely one thing I noticed with your first novel, Our Lady of Inferno, was the amount of like detail. It was written in a really professional manner, and more so I thought than a lot of some of the other indie books I had read around that time, and that's
Well,
part
thank
of what
you.
really drew me into that. So, want to tell us a little bit about that one and what brought it about?
So, I mean, that really ties into something I don't talk about. Well, I don't get to talk about often, but I'm something of a thwarted literature snob. It's probably no surprise after everything that I just talked about for the past couple of minutes. All the books I was reading Stephen King and Clive Barker in high school. I've always been a horror fan. I'm not one of these people who's like trying to say like, oh, well, I'm not really a horror writer, or like, oh, I got into it because that's where there was some money and then I wanted to get away from it. That wasn't the case for me. The first grown up adult books I read when my parents decided it's time for you to start reading grown up literature. You're in middle school now. It's time to get rid of the kids' books. My dad bought me A Clockwork Orange, and my mom bought me Stephen King's The Shining off of the drugstore rack at Eckerd's. And so those were the two books that launched me into my adult reading career, were A Clockwork Orange and The Shining. And so horror was something that intrigued me, but horror wasn't what I was writing. The very first book I wrote in 2006. No, not 2016. I was 16. It was 2002 because I saw Road to Perdition and read Michael Cunningham's The Hours in pretty close proximity to E.L. Doctor as Billy Bathgate, which is still one of my favorite books of all time. And it's an incredible gangster story. It's like literary gangster fiction. It's the story about this kid who becomes a gopher for a mobster in the 1930s, and it's very much a parallel to the world of the stockbrokers of the 1980s. And the book ties the line between the gangsters of the 1930s and the Wall Street tycoons of the 80s. And it's really funny and violent and sexy and clever and witty. And it's not quite like any other gangster book you've ever read, but that was a huge inspiration for me. Michael Cunningham's The Hours, which I mentioned a second ago. And then I saw Road to Perdition with Tom Hanks and Paul Newman, and I was like, that's incredible storytelling. You're reading these incredible books, and you're not getting any younger. I was already having a quarter life crisis at 16. And my parents had gotten me a subscription to Entertainment Weekly for some holiday. And I still remember I came home from seeing Road to Perdition with my folks, and I took a straight razor or box cutter or whatever I had at the time, and I cut this advertisement for Road to Perdition out of the Entertainment Weekly, and it might have been the back cover. I might have had to cut it out of it, and I taped that to my closet door so that I would see that every time I came in my bedroom, every night I fell asleep in bed, as my reminder, my inspiration. You need to start writing now because you're 16 now, but you're not going to be 16 forever, and you're going to wake up one day and maybe you will not have written anything. And so you've got to start now. And so when I was 16, I wrote my first book, and it sucked. And it wasn't a horror story. It was this incredibly ambitious for a 16-year-old story about this single father and his stepdaughter living during the Great Depression in New York, and they're homeless, and he lost all of his money in the stock market crash, and his wife died, and he's become an alcoholic, and his stepdaughter and he have this sort of paper moon style relationship, and she tries to reconnect with this mother that she never knew by visiting the places that meant something to her while she was alive. And I haven't touched this thing in 20 some years now, and it's probably the absolute worst thing you've ever read. But when you're 16 and you have ideas like that, you think that you're going to get the Pulitzer Prize, and that Zoetrope's going to be knocking at your front door to buy the film rights. that wasn't a horror story. My second book wasn't a horror story. That was this like really pulpy road story, which will also never see the light of day. The third book I wrote was the first time I really dipped my toes into horror waters, and that also owed a lot to the exploitation movies I was watching at the time. So it sort of walks this line. It's probably the one story from that era that I would ever consider revisiting, and it's set at this bar on the Texas-Mexico border, and it's about this sleazy bar owner who uses his bar as a front for a drug and prostitution operation, and this pimp asks if he can lay low there because he's gotten in debt to a cartel boss. And there's all of this wrangling between the bar owner and these criminals down in Mexico. And it started out supposed to be this sort of bring me the head of Alfredo Garcia type neo Western adventure on the border. And then I was just like, you've introduced all of these super sleazy characters into the story. And I spent like the first quarter of the book just really building the bar and its atmosphere and the people who hung out there. And I was like, you've done a really good job in creating these really nasty guys. And I would read these stories to my brother and his friends, and they just like all hated these characters. And they were like, I hate these guys. I want to hear more about the story. And I was like, you should start killing them off.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like a quarter of the way through this book that's supposed to be a Sam Peckinpah ripoff, I decided to make it a slasher story. Um, Anyway, I'm really dragging this out. So all of this is to say that I've always had an interest in horror. I've always loved horror media, horror cinema, horror books. I still have the first edition hardback of The Shining that I got at the used bookstore in Oklahoma. I've got the Splatterpunks anthology that Paul Salmon edited. Anybody who's read anything I've written knows that I'm a horror fan, but I never really super wanted to write horror stories. I really wanted to be like a lit fiction guy. I wanted to be the person out there writing the next Hours, the next Billy Bathgates. I wanted to be the next E.L. Doctorow or Chaim Potok or Philip Roth or these like great Jewish writers of the 70s and 80s that I was reading at the time. And I thought that I could, join that pantheon. And in 2012, I pitched Rue Morgue magazine on a story. My wife and I were regular attendees on the horror convention circuit from 2010 up until COVID hit. We just really haven't had a desire to return to conventions post-COVID. But for a decade there, we were like clockwork on the convention circuit. In 2012, I pitched Rue Morgue because I'd really wanted to write a story about this actress named Vanessa Howard, who was this very brilliant, yet sadly thwarted actress who was in a string of horror films in the swinging London era. She was in a couple of movies with Peter Cushing. She did one with, what's his name? He was a pop idol at the time, Paul. The name of the movie is What Became of Jack and Jill. But her big claim to fame is this movie called Girly, which is one of the best horror comedies people listening to this have never seen. My elevator pitch for it is Violent, Sexy Addams Family in England. And it's about this British family who kidnap homeless people and gigolos and war veterans, and they take them out to this decaying mansion in the countryside and force them to join their family and play the game. And it's all this metaphor for British colonialism, but it plays just completely unhinged. It's one of these things where if you know what the movie's talking about, then you can see the parallels. And if you don't know what the movie's talking about, it just seems like the most batshit thing you've ever watched. And that's Girly. And I rescued this thing from a VHS bin in 2003 or 4 when they were doing the transition to DVDs, and all the video stores were getting rid of their VHS stock. And I literally walked out of a local video store in Oklahoma, literally walked out with an armful of VHS tapes because they were selling them for between 25 cents and $5.
Mm-hmm.
And I had disposable income for the first time and was living in this small town in Oklahoma. And I didn't drink, I didn't do drugs. My parents bought me my video games, so I spent all my money on movies and music. And I don't even remember. At the time, it seemed like a fortune. It was probably something like actually $20. And so I get this movie Girly, and it just blows my mind. And Vanessa Howard is this incredible actress. She, you watch this movie and it really seems like she legitimately thought, I'm going to get nominated for the BAFTA for this. And then she just disappeared off the face of the earth. And it puzzled me how could such a brilliant actress and such a great movie never really do that much more? She made, I want to say, between 10 and 12 things. The number can vary depending on whether you count television performances or not. And then also there's some things she may have done that might be lost. But she wasn't really that super successful. And so I pitch Rue Morgue at this horror convention in 2012. Hey, there's this really great movie, this really great actress that nobody's really watching, nobody's really writing about. And Rue Morgue didn't really think that it was the right story for them at the time. But the editor in chief at the time, Dave Alexander, said, look, I appreciate your enthusiasm. I appreciate your passion. You clearly know what you're talking about. We need somebody to start doing DVD reissue reviews for us. Would you like that as essentially a foot in the door, kind of entry level position? And that was 2012. My first piece ran in Rue Morgue in 2013. And then I was a regular contributor to the magazine and website for the next 4 years, which gave us even more excuse to hit the convention circuit. Flash forward a couple of years, my wife and I had watched American Mary during an incredibly brutal freeze in Gotts, and Houston is not Free City. It's incredibly unusual for them to shut down the schools and to close the city because of a freeze, but that's how cold it was this year. And so we spent the whole day binging horror movies, which was great. And one of those was American Mary. Blew our mind. Not the kind of thing that you have seen before or since. I love the Soska sisters, but American Mary, that's a once in a lifetime, a once in a generation type of movie. And when I found out that the Soskas were going to be at a convention my wife and I were going to that year, I was like, oh shit, gotta meet them. This is so cool. We just watched this movie of theirs, and now they're going to be at this event we've been going to for a couple of years. We got to see them in person. And that was the highlight of that convention that year. Did get to meet the Soskas. There's a picture of me at their booth somewhere around out there. It was real fun, and attended a panel that they did. And I don't know if this was intentional or not, or if it was just kind of a fluke that year, but many of the panelists and guests were women. It was kind of a majority female guest horror convention, and sort of the recurring theme in all of the panels and everybody that I met was there's not really good roles for women in horror right now. There's not really good creative roles for women in horror right now. There's not a lot of directors, there's not a lot of writers, and the characters especially really suck. We're going back a decade plus now. We're not talking about the current horror landscape. We're talking about the horror landscape of about 2013, 2014.
Yeah, it was pretty bad.
Yeah.
It was
And
horrible.
it was. And talking to the Soskas about this regarding American Mary, Mary Mason at the time was one of very few iconic female horror characters in terms of being the killer slash villain slash antagonist slash monster, for lack of a better word. Mary is definitely the villain, protagonist, anti-hero of that movie. But you know what I'm saying here. We got Freddy Krueger, we've got Jason, we've got Leatherface. We don't have Justine, and we don't have Frederica Krueger.
No.
Even now, I mean, I think probably Pearl from Maxine and X is probably one of the bigger female horror villains, and even that's set in a universe where she's not coming back. Maybe Mia Goth's Maxine is going to break bad in a sequel in the 90s, and we'll have Maxine and Pearl as these deuteragonists. But that was the theme that year: is women are in horror and we're there to look sexy and die, and occasionally somebody throws us a bone and lets us direct a movie so they can pat themselves in the back for giving a woman some money and letting her direct a horror movie, and then things kind of go back to business as usual. And I was sitting there in the Soskas panel, and I remember the exact moment I thought to myself, you're a writer, you're sitting here listening to two people talk about how there's not good parts or characters for women to play. Why don't you do it? And for a long time at the time, I had been trying to conceptualize a serial killer story. This was going to be a foray for me into horror. I had really started dipping my toes into horror waters at this point. And I wanted to do a serial killer story about a serial killer who thinks that they are the Minotaur. I've been in love with Greco-Roman mythology for as long as I can remember. I wore out a VHS tape of Clash of the Titans, the Medusa fight at the end. I rewound and fast forward that. The entire rest of the tape was fine. You get to Perseus going into Medusa's lair and the tape would short out on you. And so I thought that was such a cool idea when all of these television shows in this time frame here in the early 2000s, early 2010s, started playing around with Minotaur serial killers. The first place I saw it was Dexter. And it's season 3. The big bad that season is Jimmy Smits as a lawyer who Dexter lets into his life. And it's this very, I'm being nasty saying it like that, but it's a compelling idea. What does happen when the super reclusive, secretive serial killer decides to let somebody in on his life? So that was a fascinating idea for me. But the same season where Dexter's existential crisis is the bad guy, in 2 episodes, there is a serial killer who thinks he's the Minotaur, and he converts condemned buildings into mazes and then kidnaps people and has them run them and hunts them and kills them. There's your season villain. There's your Trinity killer. There is your psycho alpha male rape gang. That could have been the legendary season 3 of Dexter versus the Minotaur killer. And I mean, how cool would it have been to have had a season finale of Dexter that is a stalk and slash sequence between Dexter and a Minotaur killer in a maze in a condemned building?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would have been pretty gnarly.
That writes everything. That writes all the checks. But no, Dexter kills him in 2 episodes. Around the same time, Venture Brothers plays it for a joke. There's the episode where the Monarch, after he and Mrs. Doctor the Monarch break up, he converts the cocoon, the hive. It's been so many years since I watched the Venture Brothers, but the Monarch converts his lair into a labyrinth and like has the back tat like Red Dragon, but it's a Minotaur, and he's like, "I am the mighty Minotaur," and it's like making people run this maze to cope with his wife leaving him. Again, it's a joke. It's a funny joke, but joke. And then finally, American Horror Story season 3. There was something about season 3s of television shows around this time getting hooked onto the Minotaur, but season 3 of American Horror Story has, Madame Lalaurie Minotaur Monster Man, and he basically gets killed off screen. Like, we see his head fly across the screen, and then the Minotaur is dead. And it's like, why hasn't anybody made a feature-length thing and taken it seriously about a Minotaur serial killer? So we go back to the Soskas at Texas Frightmare Week. I met them at their booth after the talk because I remember 2 moments very clearly. The first was them saying there's not a lot of great roles for women in horror on this panel. And then I met them at their booth afterwards, and the thought really crystallized there. The idea really got solidified there because we got talking about Polish and Hungarian, because the Soskas are Hungarian and they speak Hungarian. And I can't remember how we got onto that because my family has Polish ancestry and I know like 25 Polish words. And Jen Soska brings up, my favorite Hungarian swear word is kurva. It means whore. Mm-hmm. And the thought clicked in my mind at the time, and you know where this is going because you've read the book.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be a delightful idea, a character in a story who is a prostitute and her last name is Curva? Mm-hmm. I just like to do silly word games that only I understand. Every single one of my books has jokes going on with the characters' names that have significance to me and anybody who cares to dig that deeply enough into it. And I was like, oh, it'd be a great idea. There's a character and she's a prostitute and her name is Curva. And I was like, well, wait a minute. Serial killers prey on prostitutes. They're frequent targets. That's a reason that a lot of serial killers are able to fly under the radars, because they target sex workers. Then for a serial killer, all these ideas started coming together. Mm-hmm. I know I have this very circuitous way of storytelling, but we go back here a moment to about 2006. And from 2006 to 2013, I worked on a book that is actually kind of sort of seen the light of day, but in a very unusual way. It's not quite a trunk novel. I'd really gotten into the history of Times Square, especially the post-war era up to the Giuliani Koch era. And that whole time frame from Times Square super rapidly going from the gem of New York into the Abel Ferrara hell on earth that we know from Taxi Driver and movies of that vintage. And I gotten super interested in Times Square, exploitation movies, 42nd Street history, the Deuce, grindhouses, yada, yada, yada. And so I started writing this book in college around 2006, 2007, would have been around, because it's around the time that my mom got sick with leukemia. Because this was a distraction for me while she was in the hospital, was working on this book. and I was putting this insane amount of research into it. I wanted it to be the Boogie Nights of exploitation stories, going back to being young and having unrealistic ambitions. I really thought that I was going to write this epic James Michener, the guy who wrote those doorstops like
Yeah.
Texas, South
I
Pacific.
love Michener.
Yeah, it's Michener. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I thought that I was going to be the Michener of Times Square and write this like epic book that told the story of 42nd Street at the height of its decadence in the late 1970s, and I was going to take it into the 1980s and the AIDS and crack epidemic reaching their fever pitch and ended in the 80s with this theater getting shut down. And I was going to tell the story of 42nd Street through this one theater and the people who work there. And I worked on that for like 7 years off and on. And I got up to like 200,000 words and like 25 main characters. And like nothing had happened. It was like a bunch of unconnected short stories, essentially, with no endings, that just kept flowing into one another. I had no idea where this was going, really. I just kept introducing new plots, new characters, and I just finally had to abandon this thing. But the benefit of that was that I kind of accidentally gave myself my own half-assed amateur Master's of Fine Arts degree. I learned a ton about creative writing during those 7 years, where I didn't really submit. I definitely didn't publish. I was submitting short stories to my college's literary journal, which were just edited versions of sections of the book, since they were since the chapters of the book were so functionally like short stories. I would like excerpt a chapter from this book, like maybe add a resolution in one paragraph or so, and submit it. And they loved them. I ran at least 2, maybe 3 of these stories while I was in college. But I ended up with 200,000 words of creative writing that I couldn't really do anything with. And I was like, you've got this great background. You got this movie theater you've really developed and the people who hang out there. And so what I started doing was I started pulling elements from this. And I was like, all right, serial killer, 42nd Street. Prostitute who's going to be preyed on by the serial killer. Her last name is Curva. And these all started to form the seeds for what you now know as Lady of the Inferno. And Virginia Curva, my heroine, became I don't know where I was going with that one. I should stop speaking while I was ahead.
Well, I have that same problem. I will go on if I talk too much. Except I don't stick on topic nearly as well as you do. So, but
I stayed on topic.
Well, yeah, because, all of that encompassed my question. I asked where you came up with Our Lady of the Inferno, and for me, someone who's read it, I already know all of that, how all that's connected. So I was really, and forgive me, my memory's terrible, so I don't remember the antagonist's name, but she really is one of my favorite characters from any book I've ever read.
Thank you.
You did so well, like just creating this sort of cold and awkward individual with just driven. She had just a really driven, and I don't know. I don't want to give anything away just in case people want to read the book. But I really liked too how you created the labyrinth slash maze or whatever for her ground. I thought that was it was very genius the way you came up with that. I thought.
Gosh, I don't know about G, but thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I should have mentioned that a moment ago. That's the one thing I didn't cover. Is the idea occurred to me: female serial killer. Make a villainess versus a heroine, and have the story about these two. As my wife, these is my wife's phrase here, not mine. So if anybody's mad, be mad at her. These two alpha bitches going at one another against the backdrop of decaying 1980s New York City. And going back to thwarted things and ambitious things, my professional background, my academic background is in behavioral and abnormal psychology. I was a very practical child, which is its own conversation. And I knew from like when I was 12, like, oh yeah, I want to be a writer, but I know writing's not going to pay the bills. I need a 9 to 5 job. And I think I was probably like the one 12-year-old at my school who had the words 9 to 5 job in his vocabulary when asked about his future. I'm going to be a writer, but I'm going to hold down a 9 to 5 job at the same time. And I'm from this generation that grew up on Silence of the Lambs and CSI and the original Mindhunter book that John Douglas put out that the Netflix series was based on, and was part of this generation. We all thought we were going to grow up to be Clarice Starling, catch serial killers and profile people, but I took it really seriously, and that's actually what I went to college for. And I've actually got a bachelor's degree in abnormal psychology and studied this stuff in college. And by the time I got to the end of college, realized it's a lot more fun and interesting to read about this stuff in book than to have to deal with it in real life.
Mhm.
And after years of my mom being in and out of MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston with leukemia, and my working full time and going to school full part time and full time off and on, depending on how well she was for 7 years, and living in this world, I got my bachelor's degree, and I got the offer to go on to a master's degree. I had the opportunity to go on to get my master's of ab psych, and I was like, I don't want to live in this world anymore. I can't. It's gonna destroy me. I don't know if I'm gonna make it out of my 30s. If this is my life. I figured at the time, I think it was 26 when I got the invitation for the master's program. And I was like, you got 4 years left in your 20s. You'll maybe make it out of your 30s, and that'll be it. And so I was like, this is really great stuff to have in my back pocket. And hopefully, God willing, I'm going to do something with it one day, but I'm not going to be a behavioral psychologist. I'm definitely not going to apply for the FBI special agent program, which had been an ambition of mine at the time. We had some speakers in one of my government classes, and I like had a checklist of everything I was going to need to do in a notebook in order to apply for the special agent program. And of course, that didn't pan out. Um, so I've got this degree, and so I realized, hey, you know, you have an inkling at least of how the human mind works now. Apply that to your writing, apply that to your characters, use this to craft fully formed, realistic, three-dimensional people. And so that's what I did. And it's especially helpful with my villains because I can really delve into that psychology. And you talk about Nicolette Astor, who is
Yeah, there you go.
yeah,
Nicolette.
of Lady Inferno. She is the safety inspector of Staten Island landfill who believes she is the Minotaur, and she kidnaps people to bring back to Staten Island landfill at night to hunt and kill as her labyrinth. I call it Staten Island landfill in the book because I didn't think people would believe it was actually called Fresh Kills Landfill. That's the only thing I changed about the description was the name, but it comes from Dutch. I believe kills is waters or like fishing area. I think fishing ossuary. I think, but they named it Fresh Kills and it stuck. And so in the 70s and 80s, Staten Island had Fresh Kills landfill, which was the largest landfill in the world at the time. The largest heap in the landfill was taller than the Statue of Liberty, and it turned into an actual disaster area that was being preyed on by rabid dogs, not rabid dogs, feral dogs, like feral dogs moving into the landfill. Snakes and rats were breeding in the landfill. And Fresh Kills Landfill actually had to wage a war in the 80s against the wildlife that was taking over the landfill. And so that just seemed the perfect labyrinth for a Minotaur serial killer. And everything you talk about, the awkwardness, the creepiness, the detachment about Nicolette, that is all as accurate as I could be with a 4-year bachelor's education. My depiction of something that's called schizotypal personality disorder. Many people have diagnosed Travis Bickle and Taxi Driver with a more mild case of this. I decided to jack Nicolette's up because that made the things that she would be seeing and doing and thinking creepier and weirder. So I took Travis Bickle's probably like 6.5, 7 schizotypal, and I jacked it up all the way up to 11 for Nicolette. But everything in that book is hopefully now there's maybe going to be some behavioral psychologist watching this who's going to blow up my DMs, and I'm going to find out all these years later I shit the bed with my schizotypal portrayal. But I did my job right. It's a psychologically accurate portrayal of this thing called schizotypal personality disorder. That's I'm not going to say anything because I don't actually have a master's degree. Anything I say here, I don't want people to take it the wrong way. Completely layman, completely taking out of the equation that I've got a bachelor's degree in this. Probably the easiest way to explain it is that it's a more, it's a kind of a high functioning form of schizophrenia, where like Travis Bickle, you can be out in society and holding down a job, but then inside it's just like absolute unhinged and detached from reality. And in some cases, you can be interacting with a person with schizotypal personality disorder, and they can seem creepy and weird and a little off-putting from the outside. And maybe you think that they're an introvert, and then on the inside, like they just saw a truck pass by for like Bob's Big Burgers, and their name's Bob, and they think like they're being sent a message and they've got to get back home before like they come for me or something. But that's Nicolette's and the origins, and I've tried with all of my subsequent stories to put that same application of my psychological background into it and craft these very psychologically complex and real characters for the audience to really engage with and enjoy. And if not necessarily like them, then like spending time around them within the world of the book.
Yeah, I know that when I was reading that, I was like, man, I would really wanted to write an epic story just about that took place in a landfill. So after reading
Do
that,
it.
I was like, well, I'm not going to rip this guy off though. So
Dude, no, it's not a ripoff. It's a missing whole. Because I mean, an entire book set in a landfill. I don't know that.
yeah,
I've got scenes set in a landfill. I'm sure there's lots of books with scenes set in landfills. I'm sure if I went to my bookcase now, I could pull one off with a scene set in a landfill. That's not ripping me off. I mean, that's brilliant. That right there is how great stories are born, because you're finding that missing hole. I found the missing hole with my Minotaur Killer. Maybe your missing hole for the next thing you work on is an entire book set in a landfill. Do it.
yeah, because I'm writing really weird stuff these days, and with between, well, I don't write as nearly as much as I used to or I should, but I'm also trying to work a lot, of course, of what I'm publishing for others as well, because I'm trying to build Nightmare Press. But that's definitely something I've thought about, and because I think that your book comes back to me many times whenever I see something, because I see things on TV that remind me of Nicolette, or I'll just just it's weird things, and I've always enjoyed that book. So
Oh, thank you.
um, the other one, yeah, you mentioned 42nd Street. So I remember when I was doing interviews for my blog, I was digging around about some of your past work, and I dug up Beast of 42nd Street, and I was like, "Hey, can I ask you about that?" And you're like, "Well, no, not right now because something's going on with that." So now we can talk about that. So tell us a little bit about that one.
So, Beast of 42nd Street, this has a very unusual genesis. Beast of 42nd Street started as one of those short stories in the theater book. Andy Liu, the main character of the book, the junkie theater projectionist who is obsessed with a woman in a snuff film, started life as a supporting antagonist in this theater story. And he was the projectionist at a rival theater, and he was this inveterate heroin addict. A lot of inspiration for him came from me and my brother's high school best friend we had lost touch with because he'd gotten really messed up on drugs. And one of the last times we'd seen him, he was living in like a legit punk squat with like syringes and broken bottles and like garbage all over the place.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
unfortunate.
yeah, and he ended up actually getting bounced from the place and getting picked up by the police for what went on in that apartment. But this was all going on at the time, and that was one of the seeds for Andy Liu. And so he was the supporting character in these stories, and he popped up in some of the short stories that I submitted to my college's literary journal. And one of my classmates just fell in love with him, and she like came up to me one day after class, and she was like, "I read your story, and like this guy is just like crazy and sick, and I like want to know more about him." And she and I became friends based on that, and she wanted to read more about Andy Liu, and so I showed her some more of the theater story. We're going to celebrate our 15th wedding anniversary in 2 months. This is
Oh,
how I met my wife.
awesome.
And yeah, and she loved Andy Liu, and she loved this character, and she was like, "You need to do more with him." And she gave me a lot of advice on these characters. She was one of my very first readers, one of the only readers for this story. Uh, and so a couple of years into our marriage, I decided it would be a really fun gift to just write my wife an Andy Liu story. And it's just going to be him. He'll be the main character, and it'll be his backstory. And it had been this very minor character element in the short stories that Andy owned a snuff, and that had nothing to do with the main plot of the book, but there were all of these urban legends related to snuff films floating around 1970s Times Square. And you could not write a book set in this milieu and trying to be what I wanted it to be. You could not make the Boogie Nights of 42nd Street without a snuff movie cropping up. And so
Mhm.
Andy Liu, the degenerate projectionist, owned a snuff movie in these short stories in the original theater book. And so I wrote my wife a novella about how he got it and what the story behind that was. And I dipped my toes into some supernatural waters, and I turned it into this kind of Faustian story. And that was really fun. And she absolutely loved it. And I sat on that for the longest time and didn't really plan on doing anything else with it other than it being this gift for her. And then for special occasions, with my wife's blessing, I would give copies to friends and family. For my best friend's going away, he was the assistant manager of a used bookstore in Houston, and then he got his own store up in Seattle. And for his going away party, I printed out and had a copy of this bound for him. But other than that, nobody saw anything related to Andy Liu for years and years. Lady the Inferno comes out, quickly goes out of print. You know the story there. Jacob and I were, like he said, at the same publisher. Lady the Inferno came out, had a very brief flash in the pan success. Company goes under. Lady the Inferno goes out of print. Around the same time, Fangoria magazine comes back, and they're going to launch a literary imprint. Long story short, Our Lady the Inferno ended up on their acquisition editor's desk, and he picked Our Lady the Inferno back up to be the first Fangoria Presents imprint. It was going to be like this literary imprint of Fangoria magazine, where they were going to be publishing ambitions of doing 12 books a year. And Our Lady of the Inferno was going to be the inaugural one. And that came out in 2018, the reissue. We re-edited the book. We did some minor tweaks on it for content purposes. We fixed some stuff up that had accidentally gotten past the radar the first time around. New cover art, new internal layout, yada, yada, yada. It debuts alongside the first new issue of Fangoria magazine in 3 years in fall of 2018, and does very well. And Our Lady of the Inferno is, I think, other than selling 1 million copies, like it was a dream experience for a writer. It could have gone better, but it could have gone way worse. But it was great. They bought my book, they put it into print, they optioned the movie rights. I got the option rights back when it expired and got to keep the money. So you couldn't have had a better first time experience. And like the day the book dropped, because they released it on my birthday, which I thought was very sweet. 2018, they released it on September 11th to coincide with my birthday, because I was lucky enough to be born on 9/11, which is the reason I know you cannot legally change your birth date in the United States, because believe me, after I turned 18, I looked into it. 2 years of people saying, "Oh, you were born on 9/11. That's so sad." No shit, man. I know it's sad. I was born on 9/11. So they debut Lady the Inferno, September 11, 2018, and that afternoon, the owner of the magazine asked me, "When are you going to give us the next book?" Because this wasn't a 2-book deal, but it just turned into a 2-book deal if you want it to be a 2-book deal. And I started thinking, well, what's going to be the follow-up to this? It seemed appropriate that it would be another 42nd Street story. I didn't want to be one of these people who feels like trapped by their own creation. I didn't want to be somebody like, I don't want to put anybody in the hot seat here, but you know what I'm talking about. Somebody publishes this series of like 20 books. I didn't want to be Paul from Misery. I didn't want to be like, I didn't want to be, 42nd Street put me on the map and made me who I am. Screw 42nd Street. I'm never going to write about that again. I'm going to write about a, single mom who owns a pie shop in Alabama and make $5 million. I was like, okay, so we need another 42nd Street story. And it seemed to me there was more to tell with Andy Liu. And one of the big centerpieces, what was going to be one of the big centerpieces in the theater story, was the 1977 New York blackout. And this is something I've realized not a lot of people know about who weren't alive at the time. And even some people who were alive at the time didn't know about it. But there were massive riots and looting and vandalism in parts of New York following this blackout in 1977. And if you look at the news footage of this, it looks like bombs got dropped on the I couldn't believe it the very first time when I was still researching the theater story, and I found an old local news story on YouTube about the aftermath of the riots and just entire city blocks of New York on fire, like nothing you've ever seen outside of maybe the Los Angeles wildfires.
Right.
And I was like, I'm finally going to do something with the 1977 New York blackout, and it seems it's perfect to drop Andy Liu into that. And so that became the birth of Beast of 42nd Street. And I had done my grounded serial killer story. I thought it would be fun to branch out a little bit into supernatural territory. I had recently seen Angel Heart at the time. I'd seen a couple of other Deal with the Devil movies. I can't remember what other movies I was watching at the time. But I'd gone back and reread my Splatterpunks collection, and part of the writing process of Our Lady of the Inferno entailed having a stack of books on my kitchen table in my bathroom. And I would just like pick one up and open it at random and read to give myself inspiration. And one was Red Dragon, one was American Psycho. And American Psycho for the Nicolette sections proved to be especially inspirational to help get me into this maladapted mindset and
I
into
can see the connection.
yes, and into the mind of somebody very dangerous living in 1980s New York. And rereading American Psycho and rereading my Splatterpunks books, I thought to myself, this stuff is like so transgressive and so upsetting. And it's like these were big swings by people who knew they had one chance to put this out into the world. And those were the kind of movies that I was watching in high school and college. These subversive and very punk rock exploitation and grindhouse. And Our Lady of the Inferno, I love it, but it's belongs much more to the family of Silence of the Lambs or Night of the Comets than it does to Salo or Serbian Film or Human Centipede or the Splatterpunk story. I wanted my Red Dragon. I wanted my American Psycho. I wanted to write something that walked the line between how upsetting can I make this without you being able to put it down, and how uncomfortable can I make the reader, and how disturbed unsafe can I make them feel, but they don't put the book down. And I think a lot of people can write that book where it's upsetting and somebody puts it down. But I thought to myself, it's a challenge to write it and they never put it down and they finish the book. And a heroin addicted theater projectionist living in 1970s New York who is obsessed with a snuff movie seemed like the guy and the story and the character to do that with. And I was like, okay, I'm going to do it. And I said, you want a second book for me? And they says, yes. And I says, are there any limits? And they says, no, we want a genuine Preston Fassel story with no limits, with no barriers on it. We want you to write whatever you want to write, and we will publish it. And that was my mandate from Fangoria magazine. And if Fangoria magazine told me to write whatever I wanted, and if they want another book out of me, well, damn it, they got it. And that became Beast of 42nd Street, which was scheduled to go into publication 2020, and Fangoria got sold. And as part of the sale, the various appendages of the company got shut down because, as you remember, they had expanded into film production, book publishing, audio dramas. They were dipping their toes into vinyl with, what was it, Waxworks, I want to say. But, there was all this stuff going on. And it was this very back to basics, back to our origins kind of thing where the literary imprint got shuttered, the film production wing got shuttered, no more anything else but the magazine. Fangoria was born as a magazine, and now it's just a magazine again. And as a result of that, Beasts of 42nd Street got caught up in legal limbo, which I believe was around the time that you reached out to me. And this was the reason that I couldn't really have conversations with anybody, because at the time I was talking a lot to the HWA. The president at the time, John Palisano, was incredibly helpful in trying to help me navigate all of the weird legal red tape, because it's not that often that a book which is scheduled for publication technically belongs to a company that does and doesn't exist. And just because of everything that happened with the Fangoria sale, if it wasn't the magazine, then like the rights for everything else got really thrown into disarray. And it was a very difficult situation for the writers and for the filmmakers to find themselves in. And that's why I couldn't really say anything at the time. But thankfully, I got the book rights back to Beast of 42nd Street as part of a severance package, because I was working as a staff writer at Fangoria at the time, and I was lucky enough that they decided to kick in the publication rights into the severance package. Unfortunately, not the rights to Our Lady of the Inferno. That's a different story. I had to find a publisher who would take that one on, And I was very thankful that Encyclopocalypse Publications, run by Mark Miller and Sean Duriger. And Sean, I'm so sorry, I've never heard you say your own last name. I know I probably just mispronounced that. Because the issue for me was I had actually helped acquire some of the later Fangoria books, and I felt a sense of personal responsibility and ownership of those. And with there no longer being a literary imprint, I didn't want to be in print if those people weren't in print. And I had a couple of preliminary offers to republish Our Lady of the Inferno and buy it from the former Fangoria owners who technically legally owned the rights at the time. But I didn't want them to just buy my book. I says, look, Fangoria put out some great stuff by, McGarris, the book called Head Cheese by an author named Jess Hagman, which is really incredible. And I says, these books deserve to still be in print with my book. And if my book is not, if their books aren't going to be in print, then I don't want my book in print either. And, I had these conversations with, I want to say 2 or 3 publishers back in 2020, 2021. And thankfully, we were finally able to get Encyclopocalypse to agree to pick up the whole slate. And he took me, he took Jess, yada, yada. But that put Beasts into that, weird legal limbo at the time. And then I was trying to find another publisher for it. And Encyclopocalypse was initially happy to do it, but with this still being COVID and the days of quarantine, and Encyclopocalypse was really just getting off the ground at the time. Mark and Sean were honest with me that, they couldn't give it the marketing budgets or the promotional push of a larger publisher. And by this point, if it was any other book, I'd have said yes. And Encyclopocalypse has been a great home for me. They published another book that I wrote around the same time called The Despicable Fantasies of Quentin Surginoff, which is a subject for its own other podcast. So, I love them, but I wanted Beasts to explode onto the scene because I had been shopping it around 2 different places in the wake of the fall of Fangoria. And I was getting this, I should have plugged in my laptop. I was getting a very consistent response. I got rejected by about 25 publishers between 2020 and 2020. Beast got published in 23. I sold it in 22. So about 25 rejections in 2.5 years. And there was sort of a recurring theme to them. And it was, this is great. I love this book. It's really upsetting. My company will not touch it with a 10-foot pole. I wish I had saved this one. I had the rejection line memorized at one point and it's since gone, but it was along the lines of too tonally and topically disturbing. And it's not a violent book. Have you read that one? It's fine if you haven't. I don't care.
Yeah,
okay.
I want to.
You got a body count that you can probably count on like one hand, and it's not a violent book. It's not a sexual book. But the tone, I aimed to make people uncomfortable, and damn it if I didn't succeed. And that's what got me 25 rejection letters. And I was finally fortunate enough that Cemetery Dance picked it up and gave it that push. But that's, I've been talking so long now, I forgot what the original question was. But that's the story of Beast of 42nd Street. And the interesting thing about Beast of 42nd Street is it's divided into 3 main parts because I wanted it structured like a 42nd Street triple feature. And the second, I decided to take a page from Godfather because what I wanted to do was I wanted to include the complete original text of that story I had written for my wife, the Andy Lou origin story. I wanted to have that completely in there. And so what I did was take that cue from the Godfather, part 1 of the book, 1970s, part 2, flashback to the 1960s. There's the entire text of that story I wrote for my wife. Flash forward again to the 1970s for part 3 of the book. And we're going to wrap the story up about what happens to him now that we know how he got the movie back in the 60s. And so that middle section I'd already written, and then I had to write new content for the first and the third parts. I excised one section from the story that I wrote for my wife in the middle part of the book, and I stuck that at the end, and that's my Godfather 2 moment. And I don't want to say anything more than that because I want it to have a authentic, I want readers to have an authentic emotional response when they read that final part of the book. But just as a part of the genetic criticism, I really rearranged stuff and like wrote stuff at different times and then played those things you used to get the holiday times, your stocking stuffers, where you got that grid and it's got like the little slides on it. And you slide it around to make a picture. And that's what I did with Pieces of 42nd Street.
Yeah, I look forward to reading that. We're about out of time now. Um, I thank you for stopping in. It was really interesting hearing the stories behind all these books, and yeah, I feel like I could have kept talking to you about more. I had a list of other things to talk about, so we'll have to do this again sometime.
Bring me back. I mean, this has been great.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. It's easier for me because I don't like it when I have to do too much talking anyway, because I just sound like an idiot. So it works perfectly for me.
Hey, this has
But
been a
thanks.
blast.
Well, thanks again for stopping in. And um, again, if you all want to pick up Our Lady of the Inferno, I definitely recommend that. And I haven't read Beast of 42nd Street yet, but I've wanted to for quite some time. So that's out there available as well. So yeah, and thanks again for stopping in.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. And have a great rest of the day and a great week and a great weekend.
You too.